Uh, oh, we're glad to see y'all this evening. Normally, I usually pick out 2 hymns or 2 carols for this season, but tonight we're only going to do one. But we're going to sing all the verses to it because I was looking over it today, trying to decide what we were going to do, and I just read through all the verses on this song, and it's just so beautiful. It's not one that we usually sing very much anyway, but it's certainly one that we don't sing all the verses to. And so I just hope sing along with us and just reflect on these words, if you would. It came upon a midnight clear, that glorious song of old, from angels bending near the earth to touch their harps of gold. Peace on the earth, goodwill to men, from heaven's all gracious King. The world in solemn stillness lay to hear the angels sing. Yet with the woes of sin and strife, the world has suffered long. Beneath the angels' strain have rolled 2,000 years of wrong, and man at war with man hears not the love song which they bring. Oh, hush the noisy men of strife, and hear the angels sing. And ye beneath life's crushing load, whose forms are bending low, who toil along the climbing way with painful steps and slow. Look now, for glad and golden hours come swiftly on the wing. Oh, rest beside the weary road, and hear the angels sing. For lo, the days are hastening on, by prophet bards foretold, when with the ever-circling years comes round the age of gold, when peace shall over all the earth its ancient splendors flee, and the whole world give back the song which now the
there is a reason that those songs hang around, right? What a beautiful carol, and appropriate for the world we live in right now, right? Well, I'm glad you're here tonight on this cold, wintry night. We've been trekking through the book of Acts together, and we also been talking about some of the ways that the book of Acts has played out across history. And tonight, I really want us to kind of tune in to one of the most untold stories of the Christian faith. Thank you for this evening and these friends, and we pray tonight that you would open our eyes and our hearts to see how you've been working across history and how you're working today in a place that seems so unlikely. And it's in Jesus' name we pray all that. Amen.
The day he saw missionaries in those two provinces would be the day that the Lord took him, that his mission on earth was complete.
This is Hong Kong. It's the Southern Ocean gateway into China. Now, people fly into China these days, but the early missionaries took long and dangerous boat journeys to get to China. The first missionaries in the 7th century were the Nestorians, and they came in through the Silk Road. Then the 16th century, Matteo Ricci and the Jesuits came via the ocean. Then 300 years later, Hudson Taylor arrived in Shanghai. Now that's a long way north and east of where we are here in Hong Kong. And he came to bring the message of Jesus to China. Later on, Hudson Taylor would call his ministry the China Inland Mission, precisely because he didn't want to stay via the ocean and he didn't want to stay in the safe treaty ports, but to take the message of Jesus into inland China. Now that was 160 years ago, and yet the influence of Hudson Taylor and those who followed him are still being felt in China today. How did Christian faith first come to China?
Yeah, well, the history in China is really quite remarkable. The first missionaries to hit China arrived almost at the exact same time that the first missionaries hit the United Kingdom. Wow. That we don't tend to think about those as historically simultaneous moments, but they were within 30 years of one another. And so you have these missionaries arriving in China in around 635, just really early, being sent by the bishops and somewhere in the Middle East. We can't identify exactly where they came from, but somewhere in the Middle East with this message of Jesus, and they called it the luminous religion, this religion of light that they were bringing into China.
It's remarkable because you're talking thousands of miles that people had to go over the Silk Road where they could be killed by bandits any minute and get all the way to China. A lot of the missionaries who went to China turned back before they got there. But the Nestorians were also settling along the Silk Road. So you had ethnic groups, Christian ethnic groups across Central Asia along the Silk Road. The Nestorians went along those roads, went to China, and founded a Christian faith that eventually was outlawed when Buddhism was outlawed.
There is now in the city of Xi'an an enormous stele. It's about 9 feet tall. It's larger than much bigger than I am, and it writes down the history of these missionaries and their arrival and their reception by the emperor. And so that's really where a lot of our historical facts come from. But it's not just this huge block, this giant stone, but we have various books that were written as these early missionaries are beginning to try to express the gospel in terms that made sense in a country that was becoming increasingly influenced by Buddhism.
So it was a couple of hundred years before the next incursion of Christianity into China. What was that?
So roughly the 16th, 17th century, we have the Jesuit missions to China. under the auspices of the Portuguese. In particular, the Italian Jesuit Matteo Ricci was perhaps the most famous of those missionaries that came over.
Because the Jesuits came, they also brought with Western science, including astronomy, including mathematics, and also there's fine arts, painting from the West. And so it actually created a space for people, for two countries or for two different kinds of people to come together.
So the Jesuits arrived. They'd been trying to get into China for some time. They'd been working in Japan. They were down in this island of Macau, just off the Chinese coast, for a number of years, maybe 30 years. And finally, they had this invitation to go in. And so really the first missionary group was led by Matteo Ricci.
Matteo Ricci himself also dressed like a Chinese. And so that was amazing to them because for a foreigner, a Westerner, he is willing to really learn something from China, and it's a gesture of showing respect and honor the Chinese culture.
The Jesuit mission to China, we could probably say that their influence was twofold. One was sort of short term in the sense that it lasted a couple of hundred years. It was because of conflicts between the Jesuits and the Chinese emperor, and as such. Catholicism was stomped out, was oppressed during that time, and was not really continued. Missionaries were ejected from the country and so forth. Secondly, there were many Christian converts to Catholicism during that time, and this would eventually develop little enclaves, little villages, what we call Catholic villages, throughout China that lasts until today even. So many of the Catholic Christians that we may speak of as being significant figures in the 20th century can trace their history back to the early Jesuit missions.
But the real period where many Christian groups and missionaries go to China is the 1800s. By that time, there are a lot of Protestants interested in mission. So that is when most the missionaries start going into China after the mid-1800s, and they find themselves connecting, too, with the remnants of the Christian church that had been underground for centuries.
In the early 1800s, Robert Morrison was the first Protestant missionary to China, and he came under the auspices of the East India Company. And he was based primarily in Canton and worked in translation work, and he produced the first Protestant New Testament and a primer in terms of the Chinese language, the Chinese English dictionary.
One of the next great characters coming into China was Hudson Taylor. What was different about what he did?
Yeah, he's really an amazing man. His Protestant missions in China had largely found themselves gathering in Western-controlled parts of China, or at least where there was a lot of Western influence, and they would begin to recreate little Western enclaves and invite people into those, to the church that were based in there. And it was very much sort of, you come to us. And Hudson Taylor breaks this mold and flips it on his head and says, no, the gospel is going to you.
Knowing that you're the great-grandson of somebody that has such an important place in the church and church history, did you feel any sense of kind of pressure about the name and the heritage you were carrying?
Oh, absolutely. Growing up in Taiwan, my English name is already bad enough, James Hudson Taylor IV. My Chinese name, the literal translation of my Chinese name would be to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors. So I remember 5, 6, 7-year-old being asked, are you going to be a missionary too? Which was actually part of my rebellion, so to speak, against the Christian faith, because I just got tired of being asked that question. And so, as I describe it, for a significant period of my growing up years, the thought of, or the idea, or the knowledge of me being in this line of missionaries was actually more of a burden than it was a blessing.
We want to explore Hudson Taylor's story. What was his motivation to go to China?
Well, I think obviously it was God's work in his life. And God used probably his parents, if you read his biography.
He was a man who came to faith at 17, surrendered his life to the Lord Jesus, but he grew up in a family where his mom and dad loved the Lord Jesus, but they also loved China. His father had a passion for China.
There was a growing awareness for missions following on the heels of William Carey going to India in 1793 and then Robert Morrison going to China in 1807. At that point, he had heard that medical missions was a good avenue to go into missions, and so that's what he did. And so he went and started his medical studies and saw that as a bridge to serve the Lord in China. I think in addition to that equipping, obviously he was very much involved in evangelism just within the context of where he was living. He certainly realized going to China was going to be a very difficult thing.
He prepared himself over a long period of time, didn't he? It wasn't like one day he woke up and thought he should go and then went off. It was a journey to go, wasn't it?
That's right. He did his research. He got to know what was the culture in China. He got to know what it would mean to learn the language in China, but he also paid attention to the spiritual aspects that he knew he would need to get to grips with to sustain himself in a place like China, to share the gospel with people and a culture very different from his own. So he worked hard.
So he did away with his feathered pillow. He did away with a nice mattress on his bed. He exercised. So there was a physical awareness as well. He tried to teach himself Chinese by copying out the Gospel of Luke in Chinese and learned probably 400, 500 characters along the way. So there was a number of things I think that he saw as critical. And certainly the whole aspect of faith and dependence upon God, a lot of that emerged out of his experience those years in medical school and the awareness that God was faithful and God heard prayer and answered prayer. And so it was with that kind of assurance of God's presence that he went then to China to serve.
Give people a picture how long it would take to get to China. What was that journey like?
It took him 163 days.
Hudson Taylor wanted to go beyond the treaty ports. The treaty ports were these little enclaves that protected foreigners from the local Chinese. Hudson Taylor wanted to bring the mission inland into China. That's why his organization would be known as the China Inland Mission.
It was illegal to really go inland from the standpoint of Chinese regulation. He realized that, China had 300 million people, and the vast majority of them lived outside of the coastal parts of China. There were 18 provinces without one missionary in them. And so his call and the beginning of the China Inland Mission was a call for 24 willing and skillful workers to go to these 18 provinces scattered in the inland parts of China. Thus the name, the China Inland Mission, with a focus on the inland parts of China.
So this is a bound volume of 1875, China's Millions. So it was a remarkable piece of work, and Hudson Taylor was really ahead of his time. And this contained maps, details about China, the situation with the church, stories and insights from missionaries. So this also ignited the imagination of many British Christians. And it fueled the prayers of Christians.
So tell me about the Cambridge Seven.
These were 7 young aristocrats. 2 of them were very well known in the UK. One of them was the captain of the rowing team in Cambridge. The other was the captain of the cricket team. And so when these chaps, and there were a couple of churchmen, and the others were in the army, they were not necessarily the type of people to give up what they would eventually give up to go into the backwaters of China.
This is Lord's Cricket Ground in London. If you come from countries like Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, this is sporting holy ground. To play here for England was a huge honour. In 1882, C.T. Studd played here against Australia. C.T. Studd's background is very interesting. His dad made a fortune in business in India. He then brought his 3 sons back here to England. He educated them at Eton College, and then they went on to Cambridge University. All 3 boys played cricket for Cambridge University. But C.T. Studd became famous for being part of another group in Cambridge, the Cambridge 7. These were 7 young men who had given themselves to go to China with the China Inland Mission. At the age of 25, C.T. Studd also inherited a fortune from his family, £25,000. He gave it all away. In fact, £5,000 he gave to D.L. Moody, who used it to start the Moody Bible College. C.T. Studd would go to China, then to India, then at the age of 50 would go to Africa. He and his wife Priscilla started an organisation called the World Evangelization Crusade. It still exists today, WEC. Studd once wrote, "Some people want to live within the sound of a church or a chapel bell. I want to set up a rescue shop within 1 yard of hell." Studd gave up sporting fame and personal fortune to take the message of Jesus to the ends of the earth. Tell us about C.T. Studd's cricket career.
C.T. Studd was one of the most promising young all-rounders in English cricket in the late 1870s and early 1880s. He captained his school side at Eton, he'd captained Cambridge, he came on to play for Middlesex, but he was actually picked for England while he was still at university, which even then was a fairly rare thing. One thing you have to remember about him, he was the second player after W.G. Grace to score 1,000 runs and take 100 wickets in first-class cricket in an English season. No one had done that apart from Grace until Studd came along. He did it 2 years running. Then he played one more season of cricket, 1884, and then he gave it all up. Just at the point where he was 23 years old, he could have gone on to be one of the all-time greats.
Hudson Taylor believed in the lay evangelist, and he mobilized women. Whether wives obviously went with their husbands, but also single women. And the simple reason for that was he realized that Chinese society was very conservative. And so male missionaries could not go into Chinese homes. Male missionaries could not have any contact with the women in Chinese homes.
Women are critical people in this work of God. They are not someone that are just behind the scenes. They are very visible players. And so Hudson Taylor sees them as Bible women, which means that they are equipped to go and to not just spread the gospel, but also disciple other people in the gospel. But what he didn't realize, I think, is all the repercussions this would have. For him, it was really an evangelistic move. We need women to be able primarily to talk to other women who were locked away from men. But what he didn't know is by making them Bible women, they needed to learn the Bible. Well, almost no woman in China could read. And so now you have this new literate class of women emerging.
The Boxer Rebellion around 1900 was basically a revolt that was happening within different religious groups within China. And in particular, there was a very strong antagonism towards foreigners and foreign religion, namely Christianity.
One of the rallying cries was, "It's your foreign God that has brought this judgment on us because the Chinese gods have been insulted, that you would turn to someone else." And so there became this idea of we have to expel the Christian presence. They moved very swiftly through China, and what they did as they went about is they would round up many Christians and they would kill them. Now, we often talk about the missionaries, and indeed around 250 missionaries lost their lives. But the estimates for Chinese believers is close to 20,000, maybe 25,000. So it's a much larger scale. A lot of people gave their life for Jesus in these Boxer Rebellion.
What's your reflection on your great-great-grandfather losing his wife and losing children in China?
To realize the cost that they paid to be obedient and to be faithful to God's call in their life, I think is a significant reminder to each subsequent generation that to be faithful is not necessarily an easy road. And in fact, more often than not, it's a road that comes with testing, comes with difficulties, and how can I be faithful in my generation?
So tell us about your earliest memories of being in China.
Well, I was born in North China during World War II, so my memories of that are extremely hazy, and much of it comes from my parents' stories, which I heard afterwards. I had two brothers, the three of us. My grandfather had founded the hospital, and my mother, who was a surgeon, was one of the doctors there. And we were caught in a terrible famine. So we had the Japanese army on one side, who had killed 17 million in their invasion. And then we had the Communist army north of us and the Nationalist army on the other side. And then there was a famine, locusts. Chiang Kai-shek could have sent food, but he didn't, because he wanted it for his own troops. And in 3 months, 5 million died, including my two brothers. And when I nearly died, my mother nearly died, when we joined the refugees on the road looking for food and so on, there were 10 million on the road. And there was cannibalism, people selling their children for an evening meal, you know, all sorts of horrendous things. So it was the end of that were my first memories of life.
Wow. Why were your parents there? Your mum was working as a surgeon. They went as medical missionaries?
Yes, my great-grandfather was a friend of Hudson Taylor's, and then my parents were both born in China, and after education back in Britain, they went out. And as I said, my mother, she was the surgeon and running the hospital.
Was it just medical work that they did, or was there a sense of bringing the message of Jesus to the Chinese?
Oh, I mean, even as a doctor, she brought the message of Jesus. But my father was you might call a straightforward missionary, teacher, evangelist, and so on.
It's interesting because the last time he traveled through China was in 1905. He died on June the 3rd, 1905. And his desire on that last trip to China was to visit two provinces, the province of Henan and the province of Hunan, which are sort of in the central part of China. And the reason why he wanted to go to those two provinces was because those were the last provinces to open their door to missions. The day he saw missionaries in those two provinces would be the day that the Lord took him, that his mission on earth was complete, that the gospel had gone into these 18 unoccupied provinces. And through the efforts of CIM missionaries, the church had been established in these 18 provinces.
In 1949, the Communist Party basically was taking a stance with Christianity that to be Christian, you have to be loyal to the Chinese state. Foreign missionaries would be kicked out of the country, and Chinese Christians would need to state their allegiance with the state. From 1966 to 1976, during the Cultural Revolution, this was a period where a lot of Christians would be imprisoned or eventually died.
In the late 70s, early 80s, China opened up again because there were those who thought there would be no church left.
Right.
What did they find?
Just an incredible, dynamic and vibrant group of Christians who had not only survived, but had now were actually multiplying at unbelievable rates.
Now, the church in China is actually looking to do mission itself. It doesn't see itself as just a place receiving missionaries. Now, it sees itself as a missionary, and they do it in unique ways.
Yeah, I love one of the places where I've been meeting a group of young people who were training to be missionaries. And during the daytime, they were learning how to cut hair. And so they were getting a degree in hair cutting as barbers. But then in the evening at school, they would gather together and they would do Bible study. They were studying mission theory and evangelism, and then also a foreign language. In this case, they were studying Urdu together. And at graduation, they were handed a diploma that said, you are now certified in China to cut hair, and given a pair of scissors. But then they were also given sort of a silent charge that said, and now go in the name of Jesus Christ with these scissors to the ends of the earth. And the idea was, wherever you go, you can always find someone who needs a haircut. And that can buy enough rice for you to walk to the next town, and then to the next town, and to the next town, until you reach somewhere like Pakistan, where you can be a missionary for Jesus, cutting hair and sharing the good news.
So I have a question already.
Yeah, do you? Okay, so that's the story, of Jesus in China is a great story, and then also one that's got a lot of heartache connected with it too, right? That is there. So yeah.
So what's the status of Christianity in China now, today?
Well, maybe, we took a mission trip there. What was that, about 7 years ago, right? We went to Beijing and learned a lot. And at that time, China had continued to become more and more open to Christianity, and you had seen really an incredible growth in the Christian faith across from the 70s and 80s when they went back up until, maybe 2010. And at that time, their estimate was that by 2025, there would be more Christians in China than there were in the United States. I mean, it was phenomenal how the church had grown. And most of it was underground. The Chinese government's still in charge. This policy that he mentioned about if you're going to be a Christian, you have to give allegiance to the communist church was still the official policy. And so there were, they call them three-way churches because they were state-sanctioned churches, but the pastors all had to say that their allegiance was to the Communist Party. And often they were just propaganda fronts. And that was sort of you see a physical building, a lot of times it was a building that was one of these three-way churches. But the underground church was the one that had really exploded and was all over China. And they had all kinds of complicated ways of letting people know where they were going to meet and all these intricate systems, and they've been developing them for, 50 years now. And so that part is pretty amazing. And, I would assume that the church there continues to thrive, but it has been under unbelievable persecution over the last about 6 years. The communist government in China took a significant turn toward the hard line maybe 6 to 7 years ago, both in their policies toward the world and also internally toward any kind of religious groups or groups in general. And when we were there, one of the things we learned was, first of all, complete police state. Like they're watching everything you do. They're tapping your phone, watching the video on your phone. A lot of the Christians we ran into had put tape over the camera on their phones because they were convinced that all of them had been hacked, right?
And that was a question I had.
Yeah.
How does technology affect evangelism in China?
Yeah, it's a huge
with
thing.
With facial recognition and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, they have to be really careful. And there's a lot of bad stuff that happens. A lot of pastors get put in prison and all that. And what we learned while we were there is that the Chinese government is not just against Christianity, they're against any organization. And the pastors that would get in trouble and would get put in jail would be put in jail for organizing. And so if there was any evidence that you were trying to organize with another church or another group, or you were in connection with some other group of people, then that would throw up red flags. And because they're so concerned about controlling any organization at all is a threat, and they would crush it. And so Christianity, I mean, we organize, right? So, I used to joke that, they should all be Baptists because we're terrible at organizing. So, that we would be we'd be the perfect thing. And in some way, a lot of the churches are very Baptistic. The Catholic Church is almost completely irrelevant in China. Like it's almost not to be found because they, Baptist churches or Baptistic churches are independent by nature, so it's easier for us to go do our thing. But the Catholic Church is a big organization. They see a huge threat. So Catholicism absolutely has been crushed in China. So all that's there is what we would sort of see as our normal evangelical kind of thing. And there are millions and millions, but they're all underground and under lots of persecution.
So I know I'm getting away from the video a little bit, but I'm just interested in this. So if you go over there as a missionary group, do you go?
Oh yeah, no.
You go as a secular.
Yeah, you're doing something else. And we met while we were there. We worked with the International Christian Fellowship, which was the church in Beijing, and it has a fascinating story. It was founded by a group of United States diplomats who started the church out of the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. And they started as a Bible study, and over time it grew to become a church, and it was an international church, and it was out of the deal. And then they caught this vision for international diplomats. And so they started growing and ended up finding a place that they were able to rent. And the Chinese government would let them evangelize anyone except Chinese. And so but when we got there, by the time we got there all these years later, there's actually 1,400 members of this church, which is a lot, and they met in over 18 different languages every week. And so they had a French, and they had a Swahili, and they had a whatever, and they had started all these little pods, and they said, people come to America, and when they come to the United States, and if they go to New York or they go to Washington, D.C. or whatever, they're aware that there's Christians that might get them, but they never expect to be evangelized in China. So we saw it as a way to sneak up on them. And so but anyway, it had grown, but what was interesting is the only Chinese people that could go to that church were people who had already traveled out of China. And if you had left China, I guess they figured you'd already been poisoned or you'd already been exposed or whatever. And if you could show a passport at the door of the church that said you had been out of the country, then you could go to church there. But they could never evangelize anybody that was Chinese or from China who hadn't traveled out of the country yet. That was the rule. And they had guards at the front door of the church, and as you came in, you had to show your passport to show that you had left China before, and you could come in. And so that church got to pretty much operate in the open because they were kind of this distinct niche thing, right? But the churches that were trying to reach people that were Chinese, which billions of people, right, or hundreds of millions of people, right, they had to do it all underground. And so that part really quite fascinating about that whole thing. So obviously the thing that was not mentioned that you might have been familiar with is Lottie Moon. So Hudson Taylor shows up in 1855. In 1872, Lottie Moon arrives, and she's a single woman, and she's working with other Baptist missionaries that are there in the port. And she gets tired of teaching school to children and says, I came over here to evangelize. And so she ends up going inland, and just like Hudson Taylor did, and she starts planting churches and doing evangelism and does it for over 40 years. Hudson Taylor dies, I think they said, in 1905. She died in 1912. And her writings talk about the Boxer Rebellion and the persecution and the famines and the plagues and all those things that she went through, kind of in a contemporary way to what was going on with Hudson Taylor. So it's amazing, 40 years in China. And all that time, they're sowing all this seed that all these years later has been faithful even under great persecution. And the Chinese government now is really ruthless. I mean, you're watching the news. They're harsh on Christians, but they're also harsh on Muslims and any other kind of faith, Buddhists too. The Uyghurs are this group of people that are in the western part of China that are Muslims, and they're being enslaved. And they're setting up these huge internment camps, re-education camps, that hold tens of thousands of people and bringing them in and forcing them to go through this thing to try to educate them out of any kind of religious belief whatsoever. The thing in China is amazing, a great spiritual war. You've got I think China's as bad as Germany ever was. I mean, it doesn't get the same press, but it's horrible the way that they treat people and the way that they're treating minorities and the way that they oppress religion and any kind of freedom of thought or expression. And how much it is all this technological, like you mentioned,
Yeah.
And then they talked about the Cultural Revolution, and I don't know how much. I mean, in history, I never studied it. Like all of my professors got to World War II, and they quit it. Right? They didn't ever make it past 1945 or whatever. But in the 1960s and 70s in China, as communism became more and more powerful coming out of the 50s, the Cultural Revolution was this moment where the Communist Party wanted to crush any semblance of the past. And so, you know, I mean, I think it's 50 million people were killed in the Cultural Revolution, and most of them older people, because Mao wanted to put an end to all the old ways and all the old traditions. And so there was a systematic wiping out of all the professors, all the teachers, all the leaders that were over a certain age. There's pictures of Chinese men that are older being put in dunce hats and forced to walk down the street, while people that are younger threw stuff at them as they walked down the street, because they were going to do away with everything about their past. And they broke with any sense of tradition in Chinese cultural history, and they also took a much stronger stand against any kind of organization or faith during that era in history. And it left China without any moral foundation at all. I mean, not only no Christian foundation for the general population, but also, you know, not even any of the traditional values that would have been passed down across time through these, you know, the tradition of history. So when we were there, like, here's this nation that is completely without any moral footing. So, and because they're completely atheist and nothing to hold them to any sense of what's right and wrong or civil rights, they came up with this policy of one child per family. You probably heard of this. And the way that they enforced it is that if you're a couple and you have a child, that child gets a certificate of citizenship, and that allows that child to go to school, to be recognized by the government for social benefits. But if you have a second child, that child is not given a certificate of citizenship. And as far as the government's concerned, they don't exist. And so that second child doesn't get to go to school. They can't apply for benefits. They can't get most jobs in the country. It's like, and as far as the government's concerned, they don't even exist. So sometimes when we were there, China, you know, they would say that a population of China is 1 billion. But Sean, who was our host, he said, you know, we really believe that the number is more like 1.6 billion. That you've got almost 600 million people in China that just are not recognized as existing. Like, they're off the books, they can't go to school. And so there were Christians that were working in places trying to help people that were in that spot and providing a rudimentary education, but it was in the poorest and most poverty, you know, corners of the country, because they didn't exist. And then just this crazy different ethic. We met with some women that were there who, it was at least somewhat common for farmers in the rural part of China to send their daughters to the cities with a letter or a note that says, this is my daughter. And of course she couldn't read, but it would say, you know, this is my daughter, and for X amount of money or whatever. And that the fathers would tell their daughters, this is the phone number for a barbershop, or this is the address for a barbershop or whatever. And when they would get there, the deal was they would pay the father a certain amount of money, and his daughter would come into basically a brothel, and she would be a prostitute. And the father would know when he was sending the daughter to the city, this is what was going to happen to her. But because he was getting paid for it, he would do it. And so we met this group of women who Christians had sort of saved out of that and had taught them how to make jewelry, and they were selling the jewelry overseas that they made together. But these are all women who had been sold by their fathers into sex slavery. And it was crazy that the ethic is such that a dad would ever do it, but there was a lot that did, you know, and such a different world. And the Chinese government a few years cracked down on the practice, at least tried to get it out of the public eye, of hiring pole dancers for funerals. Because in the Chinese mindset, the more people show up for your funeral, the more honor there is. And so they would hire women to come dance at the funerals for these families to get more people to come. And you know, that looked bad internationally, and so the Chinese government tried to crack down or whatever. But just you think about what kind of a moral fiber is missing in a culture that these are the kind of things going on. And this is, and the abortion rate, of course, through the roof because of the one-child thing and all the rest of that. But it's an amazing thing.
I mean, it seems like you look at China on TV and you see the capitalistic society and the buildings and all the
money they're making, all that.
The economy's great, but it just seems like a really dark place.
Yeah, I mean, man, that's the thing. And I think that internationally, just as far as their politics and what they do, our country should understand we're dealing with a 1.6 billion people and this communist government that drives it, that they don't have any ethic except their own power and their own money and their own progress. Like they don't have any other ethic that drives what they do. They don't make decisions on what's right or wrong. I mean, their decisions are purely based on what is best for the Communist Party in China. Like that's the only question. And, they're playing the long game. I mean, their intention is to rule the world. And, they've been around, the culture's been around for a long time. And if it takes them 300 years to become the world power, that's what they're going to do. It's a weird, that part politically is interesting. But the spiritual dynamic underneath it of this Christian church that continues to grow in spite of opposition is really the place where there's the hope and something that's pretty exciting.
So the video was pretty amazing. I saw Oz Guinness on there.
Yeah,
I mean,
love that guy. Right?
Some people have read some of his books, but I forgot that he was originally from China, and but I did not know the history of all that went on as he was talking about the cannibalism and some of his family being killed. I didn't know anything about that.
Yeah.
And I look at that and I think about Hudson Taylor and Robert Morrison, William Carey in India, and Lottie Moon, and you think about those people, and not to lessen our missionaries today, but they went through so much back then, and do we have missionaries now that's impacting the world the way they are? I'm sure we do. You just don't hear about it. Maybe we'll read about them in the history books, or my grandchildren will, but you wonder about that. You don't, where are the great missionaries today? I'm sure they're out there, and I'm not, it's just, you don't see that.
The world is different, isn't it? It's something else. So many people in China, this 1.6 billion people living in a country like that, it's incredible. We would drive through Beijing, and I mean, it goes on forever. So many people and so many skyscrapers. It's really weird as far as driving down the highway there. And I mean, just as far as you can see, I mean, we think in Dallas we've got all these skyscrapers or whatever. I mean, like, it's nothing. Like, take downtown Dallas and multiply it by 30 as far as you've just got skyscrapers as far as you can see in every direction off the highway, because you've just got so many people. And it's funny. Like, getting on an elevator in China, like, you better not try to be, like, gracious or chivalrous or whatever. Like, you'll never get on, because they don't really believe in lines. Like, if you're thinking about lining up or it's your turn, like, they don't do that. Like, every time the elevator comes open, they cram on. And if you get on, then good for you. And if you wait till the next time, that doesn't mean you might get on the next time. It's so weird.
I have heard that recently I read something about this, and I don't know how true it is. In China, with the way they know what you're doing, they know your movement, the Communist Party does, and they have the facial recognition, they follow your phones, they have these algorithms that they keep, and they know what you're looking at, they know what you're doing. And if you do something good that's good for the Communist Party, whatever that might be, you get points. It's a point system, and like, you can then go to a good restaurant or a favorite restaurant. If you do something bad, they deduct points, and you may not be able to get into that. I don't know if that's true, but that's really scary that they can monitor you.
Yeah, it's something
so close. It's just incredible.
And that's really advanced in the last decade, but they don't have any qualms about using that. And I mean, there's no doubt that they're watching every move. And but yeah, it's a different kind of place. It makes you be thankful to be here in the States. And pray for those Christians though in China. They're working around all that, and there's some of them that are so smart and so cunning about the way that they navigate around all that system and how